All right, so we do have a bunch of questions, but while I wait for more questions to stream in, I have a question for both of you. There's one thing that you have in common, which not most people in this room have in common, is that you both have an arts background. You come from a different world, and then you've entered technology. And I really like the lens through which both of you see the world. But like, what are some things that you miss from your previous life in the world and the people in it that we should see more in tech?
That's a good question. I'm biased because it's a point I was just made 10 seconds ago or something. But one thing that every artist does is invite other people over to their studio to look at their work. And you drink a beer, you have a conversation about it. It's a very different type of conversation than the type of conversation you would have with a collector or even curator. But it's sort of the craftsperson conversation. Talk about the work, but you also talk about the craft. Yeah, I do wish that was more part. I think with Build in Public, it kind of is increasingly part of like the habitus of a developer to sort of be social with their work. But yeah, I love seeing what people are working on. I love hearing those builder stories. And yeah, sometimes I miss it.
Rachel?
I got to admit that this is probably like a more fanciful wish. I firsthand know that in order to get paid in life, you have to make things that other people want. But in the past 10 years, I feel like when I started in the industry, people were making more things that were different on the web. And increasingly, what I see is like, how all songs start to sound the same year over year as we progress towards whatever singularity the human race is progressing towards. I see web design starts to look the same more and more. And it's like you got a landing page with a call to action button and a secondary action button, and it will have one of 3 themes that's popular right now. And you can pretty much copy paste this anywhere. And though, look, here's an app that will do that for you. The creativity has just kind of left. And I'm always so delighted when I find somebody out there like Nikki Case or this guy's team that's making something different or unusual. Maybe it looks different, it works different, tells a different story, does a different thing. Then here's a site, give us money. Call to action 1, call to action 2, and the same colors you saw last week. I just love seeing new and creative things because the web's the most expressive thing I've ever gotten to work with, and I'd love to see more people expressing themselves with it.
Nice. That's actually one of the questions has a cool idea in form of a question for you, Rachel. A person is asking, could you hook the animations into, for example, an audio input and events derived from it? Like, could we animate something to the beat of the music using the CSS Animations API?
This is something I always really wanted to do, like to build music videos using the Web Audio API. But the CSS Animations API is very declarative, so it's not very good at responding to things. You could hack it, though. Like, you could hack it up a bit. But I feel like in the end, you'd probably just end up using like the Canvas API and drawing to it in response to the Web Audio API. They have slightly different models.
Nice. Rachel, I'll batch these a little bit, so I'll do another question about your talk as well. Like, how do you design those spring animations for the linear easing function? Like, is there a tool that you recommend for, sort of designing the Bezier curve other than using Make-Real, of course, and having AI do it very expensively?
I don't know if you missed it, but there is a tool that I linked to that you can like edit the spring in it directly. It was created by one of the Chrome DevRel, and you can also, like, for instance, you could draw a curve using any SVG editor, and then you could copy pasta it into there, and it would come out with the cubic Bezier. It would translate it into not cubic Bezier. It would translate it into the coordinates needed to pass to linear.
Nice. All right. I'll throw a couple of Steve-specific questions, and then we'll get back to like a common topics. I think, Steve, this is something that I also wish that I would have heard more in your talk. So maybe, what were the key sort of technical learnings that you gained from in your work in TL Draw and as possibly also the Make Real project?
Oof, lots and lots and lots. First is that it's possible to do this type of thing in the browser, in JavaScript, and rendering using like the DOM as a target. It wasn't entirely clear that was possible when I started. some of the biggest problems were related to reactive data. In TealDraw, you can basically have like parents that are rotated or moved around, transformed. They have children which are also rotated and moved around. That can be very, very deep, infinitely deep. And so you need to know when something's transform has changed based on like its hierarchy parent transform. Just picking like one example here. That is actually a really hard problem to solve. React solves it by pushing all that through the component model, but that's too slow to do for something like TealDraw. And so we needed to have the sort of basically signals, as was presented before. This was David Sheldrick's implementation of signals, which has worked really well for us. And that type of data reactivity, it's like all over the place. Some random menu button needs to know whether there's 2 shapes selected and whether one of them is an image. And like your selection is changing all the time, and you really need to like laser that data into the right place. Or is that technical learnings around multiplayer? Synchronization is a super hard problem. I'm wearing a hat from the Local First conference from a few weeks ago in Berlin. It is an unsolved problem. We had to solve it for TealDraw, and I think we solved it very well for TealDraw. But that was like, big old chunk of work. And yeah, we're still learning more in terms of performance, in terms of like leveraging different APIs or browser APIs. I think one of the most interesting things that I learned with Make Real is just how easy it is to make something that is incredibly impressive using browser APIs. So like a couple of weeks ago, I was like, you know what, I bet this thing can use the camera. And so I drew a little box and drew a dumb smiley face in the middle of it and put a little red button there. And I'm like, yeah, I want a photo booth app, right? I never told it I wanted a photo booth app, but it figured it out. And yeah, it just worked. Like, just here's me, thumbs up, press the red button, and then it'll save the image out. And yeah, I feel like we're only scratching the surface in terms of making that kind of thing work well in the browser.
Nice. And how much sort of additional prompt engineering and or sort of like architecture do you need to do for specific demos? Or is it all just like one prompt and you just lean on the capabilities of the model?
With Make Real, we've twisted and tweaked and gone back and forth on the prompt constantly. Like, I think this is using a local, branch, and I tweaked the prompt there to, One of the fun things is that if you look up on GitHub the string, you love your designers and want them to be happy, you'll get like dozens of responses, which are all people who've just copied my prompt from Make Real. That was just one of the lines in there, and somehow it just made it that much better to say, like, you're working with your designers. You love them. The happier they are, the better your score will be, or something like that. I think at one point we also had that the AI is like, you are a 12,000-year-old web developer using eons of experience and wisdom in order to create prototypes for your designers who send you wireframes. All that stuff is, it's magic, but it doesn't really move the needle that much. The basic idea that like you get designs, you can use unpackage for JavaScript libraries, you can make sure your script tag is module unless there's something like asynchronous. Like, once you have that, the rest is kind of just window dressing. What's interesting, just one last thing, is that like for the other people who use the same pattern in their app, they're able to bring in like, here's who the user is. Like, here's what kind of app this is. It doesn't build anything, it builds like specific types of things. That's when you get actually like really good results, when you just can know more about what it is you're doing and who's doing that. So, yeah.
All right, there's a small chance that this next question is actually social engineering hacking, but I'll have to ask it since it's the most upvoted question. How well does TealDraw filter out malicious prompts in Make Real? Like, how abusable is it?
That's a really good question. Well, it's your API key. It's not mine.
Yeah, I think the person's interest just flattened, when they realized.
The models themselves do a pretty good job at policing themselves. We do sandbox the code in a way that prevents it from affecting our servers such as they are. We're also just guarded by the fact that there's not a lot of information around. It's basically like the only API key is yours, and that's the only unique piece of information in the system. So like, yeah, go nuts. But yeah.
Nice. All right, so we have like a whole bunch of questions for both of you that are very sort of nitty-gritty. But as we're coming to the end of the day, I figure instead of talking about like the very specifics of, for example, the CSS API, let's finish with something sort of like a future, forward, and something that is I think that we can have a conversation about. Rachel, you're looking at Steve's demo, and you're a creative, you're an artist, you're a person who, is also a programmer, like there's a lot of these things which this thing does very badly currently, but it does it better than any machine before. How does that make you feel, and sort of, what future do you either, foresee or forebode?
Well, on the one hand, everything is a remix. So I'm not too intimidated by it. I mean, I hear my friends from my days as a cartoonist, they definitely don't like people being able to create things in their style. There's definitely a feeling of being being threatened for illustrators out there, as now anybody can get illustrations of reasonably good quality. Why would you ever hire someone to draw something again? Yep. That's real. But over in programming, I've looked at the code. It's all right. I think it's a dream that people will one day not have to deal with us as engineers, and they can just, wouldn't engineers love to not have to deal with designers? Wouldn't designers love to not have to deal with stakeholders? We all just don't want to deal with each other as humans. But the interesting thing is that this is a machine, and it's also not very good at dealing with humans. So it might make a good collaborator for now, but I'm not too worried about it taking my job.
Yeah, I saw this great quote by a Polish artist, I believe. It was something like, I don't want a robot that does art and music for me so I can have more time to do dishes and laundry. I want a robot that does dishes and laundry for me so I have more time to do music and art. Mm-hmm. Does this resonate?
I don't know. So this type of discourse was already something that I'm really familiar with just because I have a background in art, and you see it happen where, like any craft, the commodity form of that craft disappears over time or is replaced by technology. Like there was a time where like having your little miniature painted was like a normal thing that people in a certain class did, and there were people who just were miniature painters. They weren't, like, you won't find them in museums because they just weren't very good. They weren't like important. They weren't cultural contributions. They were commodity, right? They
were the medieval selfie?
Yeah, basically. And, like bassoonist used to be like a career, So that's just going to happen. That's like, you can't really like shed too many tears about it because that's just going to happen. Like there's a certain level of anime art that's just going to be created by robots. Sad for the anime artist, but it's just sort of whatever. And the question is whether front-end development or just web development or just software development is, what part of that is commodity work that is inevitably going to be replaced, and what part isn't. You could probably look at like outsourcing for identifying which parts of a project, are just like, well, let's just do this as cheap as possible, and which parts aren't. And yeah, I don't know, like Cognition, the Devon, if you saw the Devon videos and all that stuff, like they just raised like $200 million or something ridiculous. Like there's definitely a hunger for replacing that labor. I think, yeah, hard to feel good or bad about it, but it's definitely a trend.
Yeah, I mean, like it's weird because this has been the implicit logic of the marketplace for the longest time, is that we understand that making software is too expensive. So, we have developer tooling companies that, for example, try to making certain kinds of software easier. We have libraries, frameworks that, make the, improve our output and the quality of our work. And then this just seems to be following the same, logic of the marketplace. But the one question that I feel like we're not asking is that, if we are making software, cheaper and easier to create, is A, who does it enable to create software that couldn't previously, build software, and for what problems can we now start to even think about solving that previously just wasn't financially feasible? And so in this world, do you have any sort of like optimistic visions, for the future?
Absolutely. That's the part of the fun of, when these commodity forms are replaced, right? Like, there's not as many professional bassoonists, but like, we probably hear more music now than we've ever heard before. And the idea that like the ability to generate software for weird niche cases is going to be a popular, it's going to be an option for hundreds of millions of people who right now just don't have access to software for their niche case. Maggie just gave a great talk on this, the Barefoot developers, also at the same conference. Yeah, I mean, like, most of the developers that I know got into this because they were making, like, a website for their band or something, or maybe they're, like, Halo
or
Clan.
Their comic.
Or a fan page or something like that, right? And those types of things are, yeah, you don't, you only get them if you have the people who can do it. But I expect a lot more of that type of thing. I don't know.
Wow. I think you pointed out something. You said it was very powerful. You said, what are the problems that these resources free us up to tackle that were too big in the past? Like React and React Native, for instance, that it's not just one tiny team working on it. It's multiple teams from like Microsoft and from Meta, and there's like an open source component with like partnerships with Vercel and Expo, so that people who aren't part of a 1,000-people company can still build meaningful things. And the only way that those things could be built, because no one company would make that kind of investment in that platform, would be for people to operate together, engineers and companies, in open source. And the only reason we can use AI the way we're using it today, or LLMs in this case, is because we've just hit the peak for computing power. The human race has some really big problems facing it right now. I don't know, this climate change thing, squabbling over resources. You beg a really good question. If resourcing is such a problem, why are we afraid that we've suddenly freed up a bunch of resources when we have these pressing problems? Isn't there something better we can do with our time than keep designing the same landing page with the 2 buttons over and over again? That sounds automatable to me.
Yeah, I mean, just to answer, my point of view on that question, I mean, I think the problem is that the logic of the marketplace only cares about profitable problems. And so, when we can free up those resources, I mean, that's a cost. These people need to be paid and fed and clothed and all of those things. Ideally, for the people who benefit from this, they wouldn't want to do any of that. And I think this is, and we're not going to go too deeply in this, but all of the things that you, for example, Rachel, just talked about, React Native, these are corporate-sponsored projects, but they are still in open source, and they're freely available for everybody to use. I know that there are some open source models currently available in the AI in that space, but fundamentally, we are, using, like a paid for corporate, products. We're kind of ceding control to those black boxes that, we previously, could have sort of like done without in this previous world. So like, how do you, see, for example, in your line of business, you're a startup founder, like, do you see space for like, free open source software building on top of AI, or does everybody now need to go raise a seed round in order to build anything meaningful?
I don't know. For example, like, we've been pretty insistent about like not training models or fine-tuning models. Like, I don't think we've spent more than like $100 on like OpenAI credits or something like that. And that's, I guess for us, that's part of the fun, is to sort of be surfing on the publicly available models and to try and trick these things into doing what we want, and also to kind of explore their own kind of like tendencies rather than teach them exactly what we want from those models. But yeah, I don't know. I think my hope is that if you are in the business of using LLMs at scale for something interesting, that needs to be like actually useful, which is very different than, for example, like crypto or something where like you can spin a lot of GPUs for that as well. But like I think that the sooner or later with LLMs, like it's just like, yeah, you have to have something that you're actually doing with this technology. I don't know as to like whether it's just given the resources needed to train these models and stuff. Open source is probably the closest thing. Like corporate backed open source is probably the closest thing to like something that doesn't really make you uncomfortable from using like sending profits to stakeholders or something. I don't know, or shareholders. Yeah.
Yeah, and Rachel, you've spent the last few years in big tech. You know, that's kind of like it's the opposite in a way what Steve is doing. Like, is there a perspective, you know, there?
Honestly, I was just blanking out for a minute thinking, I wonder when people who have the most money in the world, like pardon me for saying this, the Elon Musks and the Bezoses and the Zuckerbergs will realize that like solving these really big problems is long-term profitable and start dumping that investment money into like, I don't know, carbon sequestration. That was where my head was wandering. It's like, I wonder when that tipping point is coming.
Well, we are getting on with the afternoon, so maybe everybody's starting to drift off. So I'm going to finish with the one final question. This is a question, it is currently the most upvoted, and it's for you, Rachel, but I'm going to kind of like modify the question, so both of you get to answer. So Rachel, the question for you is, what is next for Alice, and then what is next by proxy for Rachel? And Steve, same for you in a minute.
You're bringing existential angst with that question. I'm taking some time. I guess it's the spirit of layoffs, and I decided I'd nerd out and be a little bit of an artist for a bit. I'd like to get Alice into shape so that she can go forth and teach people the fun things I shared with you today. I'll probably do some more upgrading of my older demos. I've got like Sleeping Beauty in Space and a couple of others. I'm working on that book on how to survive your tech career. After this, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what's up. I'll figure it out. Might go back to engineering. Might found a developer influencer agency. If you have ideas, talk to me at the after party.
Teal draw. It's really the story hasn't changed. It's just gotten more interesting. We have an SDK on the market. I do way more sales-related stuff than I ever thought I would, but it's working. It's surprisingly like working. I think some of the core theses that we had about this and the value that like a primitive for this could offer are being done. So I'm just doing the startup thing. I think we're going to continue finding ways for this thing to be useful, and there are no shortage of like kind of ideas, especially I have a very creative team, and they have a lot of creative ideas. We have two people whose basically full-time job is just to play with this thing, see what it can do, and tweet about it. Those are the jobs that I'm envious of myself. But yeah, we should be doing. We finally have a landing page coming, so we should be doing. Yeah, you don't need those. You don't like the whole you don't need to program them. You don't even need to have them. It'll be fine. But yeah, we should be looking a little bit more like a company by the end of the year.
Nice. Well, my sort of narrativizing brain also drifted off, started to think a little bit about like the themes of this conference, like the 2 days that we've just had. And one of the things that I think both of you embody, and quite a few of our talks actually embody is making things, like you're both sort of like makers and creators. And I think this is not going to be a question. This is just maybe me sort of like musing and trying to bring this into a harbor. Is like I feel like now feels like a season of making. Like it feels like like we've now entered like we are maybe going from the React era into like a new library framework era where there's so much like space for like open source creators to sort of like do new experiments and fill needs and fill holes. And we have all this like boom of new technologies in AI. We have new browser capabilities. Like we have all of these things, but there's every time you sort of like open up new land, you make space to grow something. So I feel like this is the year that we can make something, and so hopefully many of you will go and make something and present it here on this stage in a year's time. So with that, let's wrap up the conference and let's give it up for our panelists. And I am going to hand the microphone to Juho, who will have a few, I am sure, erudite words to share with us. So let's get off the stage and give it up for Juho.